Good afternoon, everybody. As we're all gathering in the virtual room, I want to give a warm welcome from the Senior Executives Association to this week's really interesting webinar, which will be led by Marc Freedman. And SEA, most of you who have worked with us before know, the Senior Executives Association is the professional society association for current and former senior leaders in government. We have a robust membership of well over 1,000 people, and we welcome dialogue and encourage folks who are interested in SEA to join. My colleague Chrissy Greenleaf is here with me, and you can reach either one of us either in the chat, or you can find me any way you want. I'm the only Dan Chenock in the world, so just look me up on LinkedIn, and you'll get me pretty quickly. I will note that we're honored to continue this collaboration with the Yale School of Management, both as an association, and we've had a terrific collaboration over the years, and especially with these webinars, which have provided real insights to our community and engaged senior experts at the school. I'll also note a point of personal privilege. My brother is a graduate of the School of Management, so is his wife, and they did meet there. So it's a good SOM story. With that, I will turn it over, I think, to Kristen, who will introduce our speaker. So thanks again, and I look forward to learning from our great speaker in the next hour.
Thank you, Dan. It's so nice to be here. I am Kristen Sork-West. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Executive Education at the Yale School of Management, and I am thrilled to be here with you today. Thank you for making time for us. Chrissy and Dan are still with us on the call, but they're going to listen in just like you. And you have Marc and I here with you today. Marc and I have worked closely together in the past, but for us to show up wearing the exact same top is a new level of collaboration between the two of us. So I'm just proud of this achievement that we've accomplished today, Marc.
It's a good thing we didn't come with party hats. We might have been mismatched.
I know, and if I wore my dark glasses, people might have gotten us confused with one another. So this is great. At least we have that distinguishing us in our hair length. Thank you, Dan, for the wonderful introduction. As you said, and I echo this as well, it's been a pleasure to collaborate with SEA over the many years, and I'm so happy that we could connect with so many SEA members today. As we kick things off, just a few housekeeping items from me. We are expecting this webinar to last until about 1 p.m. We are recording this webinar, and a recording will be distributed afterwards to all registrants. And I encourage you to send us your comments and questions through the QA and chat. I'll answer some questions in the chat as best I can along the way, but for those robust, more meatier questions, we have time reserved at the end to answer those. So Marc and I are delighted to be here with you today. We're here and happy to be here to talk about transitions, sometimes what are often called the third act, or your encore career, or even middle lessons. Marc here will draw on his decades of experience and deep expertise on international or intergenerational engagement and aging with purpose to talk about navigating a new phase of life that is coalescing as we speak and the opportunities that this new phase holds for us. As I've mentioned, I've had the pleasure of working with Marc very closely, especially over this past year, where earlier in the year, Marc and the Yale School of Management launched a new program called the Experienced Leaders Initiative, or ELI, as you will hear us call it for short. ELI is a 6-month-long program designed for leaders ready to explore what life looks like after their traditional career. And it's something I look forward to talking with you more about later on in this webinar. So for now, I'm just going to give Marc a brief introduction. Marc is founder and co-CEO of CoGenerate, formerly Encore.org, the chair of the advisory board for ELI, and the author of 5 books. The Wall Street Journal named his most recent book, How to Live Forever, The Enduring Power of Connecting the Generations, one of the year's best books on aging well. He's an accomplished social entrepreneur. He was selected as a Social Entrepreneur of the Year by the Schwab Foundation World Economic Forum, is the winner of the Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship, and is an Ashoka Senior Fellow. He was previously a visiting scholar at the Stanford Center on Longevity, originator of the Encore career idea linking second acts to the greater good. Marc co-founded Experience Corps, the Purpose Prize, and Encore Fellowships. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you so much, Kristen. I really appreciate that introduction, and I've loved working together over the past few years. As Kristen said, I had the great honor of serving as the faculty director on the inaugural cohort of the Yale Experienced Leaders Initiative, and I'll tell you a little bit about that effort later on, and Kristen will as well. And I wear another hat. I'm the founder and co-CEO of an organization called CoGenerate. We used to be called Encore.org, focused on second acts for the greater good. And now we're particularly concentrating on how older and younger people can come together to help alleviate the big challenges of the day. When I heard about the opportunity to talk to SEA and SEA members, I jumped at the chance. I come from a family of public servants. I've spent my entire life in the nonprofit sector and have thought a lot about the talent pool that exists in these areas and how that constitutes an extraordinary opportunity for this second act idea. What I wanted to do today, though, is to talk about two misconceptions. Misconception is probably not even the right word, but two incompletely appreciated developments that are going to affect our entire society, but particularly people who are moving into the latter half of life. We hear a lot about the longevity revolution and the aging society, and it's all true. The numbers are breathtaking. Even after working on these issues for decades, like Kristen was mentioning, I'm still stunned when reading. So we've increased life expectancy in the United States by 30 years since 1900. For perspective, that's greater than all the increases in human history prior to 1900. So this is not just a slight adjustment that's underway. Half the children born in the developed world since 2000 will see their 100th birthday. So that's the longevity revolution. On the aging of society, the numbers were just updated. There are 12,000 Americans every day who are crossing into their 65th year. I turned 65 2 years ago. I think there were only 11,000 when I made that transition. Here's one that I'm still amazed by. 2/3 of the people who lived to the age of 65 in all of human history are currently alive. So we do have a longevity revolution. We have a lot more older people, but I'm gonna try to fill out those topics, which we hear so much about, in a way that I think will help understand what they mean. And so to start, I want to talk about the longevity revolution. And I'll tell you a story. As Kristen mentioned, I was a fellow at the Stanford Center on Longevity's wonderful organization. And I live in Berkeley. So I would drive daily to go down to Stanford over the San Francisco Bay Bridge. And as many of you know, maybe directly, the traffic in the Bay Area is terrible. So I'd oftentimes get stuck at the entrance of the bridge, where for over a year, there was a Prudential billboard which read, "The first person to live to 150 has already been born." So I got a lot of time to contemplate that notion, as well as the tagline, which was "Prepare for a longer retirement." And when I looked more closely at Prudential's numbers, I saw that they were holding retirement age at 65. So that meant an 85-year retirement, and I was thinking, as somebody who spent my whole life in the nonprofit and public sector, you can't work for 30 years and underwrite an 85-year retirement. That was a terrifying prospect. And to make matters worse, I was heading down to Silicon Valley, where billions of dollars were being invested in not just living to 150, but living forever. Larry Ellison, who just crossed $400 billion in net worth, was investing a good part of his fortune into conquering the whole idea of death. He said that he was contemptuous of death. He didn't think much of it, to which Michael Kinsley wrote in The Atlantic that it matters a lot less what Larry Ellison thinks of death than what death thinks of Larry Ellison. He took comfort in that, and also in a cartoon in The Onion, which shows a guy standing in front of a whiteboard with a pointer, and there's a flat line on the whiteboard, and the caption is "Death rate holds steady at 100%." So I'm not sure whether we're going to be living forever or having to prepare for an 85-year retirement, but I think we're spending too much time thinking about the length of life. And this is my main first point. We should be spending more time thinking about the shape of life. And we're in the midst of a transformation of what a life looks like. And particular, I want to argue that we're inventing an entirely new stage of life between the middle years and anything that constitutes old age or retirement, which probably sounds blasphemous, inventing new stages of life. They seem like the oxygen in the air, but in fact, they're not. In fact, as life has grown over the last 150 years, we've invented all kinds of life stages. There was no childhood before the 19th century. We used to dress children as little adults and expect them to act accordingly. One of my favorite stories is the invention of adolescence. In the beginning of the 20th century, we had this proliferation of young people who weren't children, they weren't quite adults. We were worried that they were going to have physical maturity, emotional immaturity, and they were going to cause all kinds of problems. So a 60-year-old psychologist, G. Stanley Hall, wrote a 1,000-page book in 1906 called Adolescence. Suddenly we had a new stage of life. And ultimately we had teenagers. We invented all kinds of organizations, from the Scouts through new kinds of schools for that population. But 20 years later, G. Stanley Hall, who's a remarkable person, he's basically the father of psychology in America. He was the first PhD in psychology. He ran the first psychological lab. He invented the American Psychological Association and the American Journal of Psychology. He's even the person who brought Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung to America, and he had the two of them living in a little house in Worcester, Massachusetts with him for a month, along with the great Harvard philosopher William James, and they spent the month studying the occult. So if that house had burned down, we would have probably had very little in the way of developmental knowledge to this day. But 20 years after he wrote this 1,000-page book on adolescence, G. Stanley Hall said, "I made a big mistake. I shouldn't have invented teenagers. I should have invented a new stage of life between midlife and old age." And he described it as an Indian summer. And he said it was a period when human beings reached the height of their capacity. He said, people didn't reach this apex until the shadows started slanting eastward. And I think what Hall meant about that was that for the first time ever, we had a lot of people who had the benefit of experience and enough time to do something with that. They were at this beautiful intersection between time lived, time left to live, and the time beyond their lives in terms of leaving a legacy. But he worried that we weren't prepared for this entirely new stage of life. In fact, he wondered about what the name for that period is. And here we are with 12,000 people a day flooding into this period, and we still don't have a name for it. Some people are calling it middlescence as a parallel to adolescence. Others have more optimistically have talked about it as the group flooding into this period as the perennials, which I love. My estimable mother-in-law, when I asked her what the stage was, she was in it herself. She said she was on her next to last dog. So I'm not sure that's the best phrase. We still need to come up with a name. But one of the things that I wanted to impart today is not just are we seeing the beginning of a new stage of life, but a new stage of work as well. And we witnessed that in our own work at Encore, now CoGenerate, through programs we were running. We started with a project called the Experience Corps, which is like a Peace Corps for older people working to help improve the academic performance of low-income young people, to help them read at grade level by the 3rd grade. And instead of Peace Corps volunteers or Teach for America or City Year members passing through for a year or two, the Experience Corps members stayed a decade. They had essentially a second act for the greater good. It wasn't as long as their midlife career, but it weighed as much. It was as significant. They were as proud of it. And it occurred to me that they were like people like Jimmy Carter, who had had this remarkable second act, in many ways, act that in terms of purpose, significance, even transcended their important work in the middle years. So we did a survey and we asked Americans over 50 whether they were in or interested in an encore career at the intersection of passion, purpose, and a paycheck. A period of life that wasn't just about the freedom from work in the way that retirement is often characterized, the liberation from labor, but the freedom to work in new ways, to new ends, with new purpose. And we found that 4.5 million Americans over the age of 50 were already in these encore careers. And 21 million more gave top priority to following in their footsteps. And when we asked both groups about the length of time, 10 years was the number, which echoed what we were seeing in our own initiatives. And when I was at the Yale School of Management in the early 1980s, I didn't stand out in my statistics classes or quantitative analysis, but even I could add 4.5 and 21 million and then multiply it by 10 and realize that's 250 million years of human and social capital that is poised to invest in creating a better future for future generations, for leading lives of new purpose. The problem is in that very same research, we discovered that people were struggling getting from what's last to what's next, to finding their way into a new chapter. The phrase in focus groups we heard over and over again is that it's a do-it-yourself process. And it's one thing if a few people are in a do-it-yourself process, but if it's 25 million people, that's a lot of pain and cost and inefficiency. Reminded me of a great quote from Joseph Campbell, one of the disciples of Carl Jung, who said, midlife is when you get to the top of the ladder and discover it's leaning against the wrong wall. And that's basically what these people were saying. They, like the SEA members, they were at the top of the ladder, but they were struggling to figure out how to get to the ladder that's on the right wall. And so, when you think about that, there are two obvious roots that we see with young people all the time. The first is an internship. I feel like we need gap years for grown-ups, right? All of our kids are getting gap years after having managed to navigate their way through high school. But what about the rest of us who've spent 30, 40 years putting in long hours, raising those kids, being involved in community? There needs to be a time to rest up, to readjust and get ready for what's next. And then I think that there's a lot of evidence that what we need are opportunities to try on new roles. Herminia Ibarra, a business school professor at INSEAD in France, has written a wonderful book called Working Identity. And she shows through years of research, excuse me, through years of research, that the most effective way to move from one career to another at any spot along the age trajectory is through experimentation. You know, it's one thing to have this beautiful vision, I'm going to open a B&B or a winery, and the clouds part and the birds sing and nobody ever breaks a sweat. But in fact, that rarely happens. It's more a process of trying on different options. You know, it's one thing to be interested in working on climate. It's another to be in a climate organization. Maybe it's a good fit culturally, maybe it's not. So we need more opportunities to have these gap years for grown-ups and to try before we buy. So at Encore, we started something called the Encore Fellowship, which was a one-year fellowship, 1,000 hours paid for people who are moving into their second act to move into an NGO, but to do it in ways that drew on their past experience and also provided a sense of adventure. So if you're working on marketing at Cisco and you move to the Boys and Girls Club of Indianapolis, you maybe you're doing marketing there. So you're drawing on what you know how to do, but also in a new setting, again, in new ways with new colleagues. So it's a nice balance between comfort and adventure. The other route that I want to emphasize, and this takes us to the Eli program, is school. Yeah, right. I mean, those are the two ways that our kids end up getting from what's last to what's next, basically internships and education. And for the longest time, we've lacked a kind of education for the second half of life. In fact, Carl Jung himself, I keep going back to that little house in Worcester with Jung and Freud and William James and G. Stanley Hall. You know, when I was talking about what the characteristics of well-being are in this stage of life, Freud really captured that. He said it all came down to love and work, to connections and purpose, to people to be colleagues with, and a reason to get up in the morning. And what Jung said in 1929 in an essay called The Stages of Life is that we need a new kind of education, a new kind of school. He said, if you live the afternoon of life according to the purpose of life's morning, basically things are not going to go well. But then he asks, but where are the schools for 50 and 60-year-olds to help them prepare for this afternoon of life, for this new chapter, in a way that has developmental integrity, that fits with the priorities of this period of life? And we started developing education for the second half of life in the 1970s through programs like Elder Hostel, now Rhodes Scholar, but those were really more designed for learning for its own sake. Programs like the Osher Lifelong Learning Institutes have the same quality. They're wonderful efforts, but what about school for the second half of life in a more comprehensive sense, including one that can help prepare people for a new stage of work as well as life? In in 2010, Rosabeth Cantor, who was a professor at the Yale School of Management when I went there. In fact, she was the professor I went to study with. She left, went to Harvard Business School. And as she moved into her own 60s, she started something called the Advanced Leadership Initiative at Harvard, ALI, where people over the age of 50, but oftentimes over the age of 60, could return to school for a year and help chart the next phase of their life and do it with a sense of community. It was a huge success. It's a wonderful program. It was duplicated by Stanford's Distinguished Careers Institute, then Notre Dame, University of Chicago, Oxford and Cambridge, University of Texas, and many others started their own versions of these programs. And while people I think have really benefited from these efforts. The challenges with them are cost. It's roughly the same cost as going to Harvard or Stanford as an undergraduate. The fact that you need to relocate, which is oftentimes difficult for people who have caregiving responsibilities, other duties, plus the cost of spending a year living in Palo Alto is daunting. And then those programs, as wonderful as they've been for helping people develop a sense of what they want to do next, haven't put much emphasis on the transition. So when we at the Yale School of Management decided we were going to try to contribute to this new stage of education, we decided to make 3 changes to complement the existing efforts. One is to create a hybrid program where you didn't need to relocate. So the Yale Experienced Leaders Initiative, as Kristen said, the Yale Eli Fellows, it just turned out I knew we were on the right track when I realized that the alliteration for Experienced Leaders Initiative fit the name of the founder of Yale. So it's a hybrid program. You come to Yale for a week at the beginning and a week at the end, and the rest of the work is done online. Second, it's a lot less expensive than these other programs, not just in tuition costs, but also because you don't need to relocate. And third, there's a big emphasis on what you're actually going to do next. We said that the 3 pillars of the program were looking inward, looking outward, and moving forward. Essentially, wisdom and self-knowledge, understanding where your priorities meet the priorities of the world. One of our speakers, Jordan Caslow, the founder of iLiance and Vision Spring, said, "What's the need that needs you most?" And so the looking outward section of the program is very much tuned into that idea. And moving forward is how do you actually get there? Another key feature of the program is the camaraderie. We had 25 fellows in the first cohort, and the depth of friendships that developed and the ability to support each other may have outstripped anything that faculty like myself attempted to contribute. But we did have great faculty for the program. Everybody from Lori Santos, who teaches the happiness course at Yale, which is the most popular course in the history of the university. Bill McKibben, the climate activist. We thought of the faculty as the best of Yale and the best outside of Yale. We had a big presence from the Yale Divinity School, a group there that leads an effort called Life Worth Living. So it was a wonderful experience. We finished the first cohort. We learned a lot from the fellows who were actively involved in co-creating the program and very much looking forward to the next iteration. So I think we need more rites and routes of passage from the earlier phases of life to the second half of life. And I think that internships in school really will be the most important of those efforts. In fact, I hope someday we come up with policy innovations to scale efforts like the Eli program. One dream I have is an early year of Social Security for people over 50 to go back to school with the agreement that they'll work an actuarially adjusted period later. We probably have somebody or multiple people from the Social Security Administration on the call. I'll finish this section by saying, you know, I mocked the longevity revolution a little bit at the beginning, but in fact, in 1935, Social Security was enacted, and in 1941, a woman in Ludlow, Vermont, named Ida May Fuller went to her local post office and at age 65 picked up the first Social Security check. She then proceeded to live to 100. She saw the moon landing. She saw the Beatles come to America. But what she did miss was the advent of this new shape of life that I think we're seeing now. And for me, I think it's one of the most exciting developments, even more exciting than the length of life, having a period, this sweet spot, which is at the intersection of mortality, the realization that life doesn't go on forever, longevity, the fact that we do get this bonus of so many more years, and I think that that's something, a gift that we've really never seen before. You know, it's a misconception that as we've added these years to life, they've been tacked on to the end, that they're contributing to that 85-year retirement that I started out, when in fact they're contributing to a phase of life that in many ways could be the best time of all. And with that, I think I'll finish the first part of my talk and take some questions from the webinar participants. And then if we have enough time, I'll do the second part.
Sure. We did get a couple in, some really great ones. One early question that came in is actually about someone who's in that age range that you've described, this post 50, before 60, in that range. And they're interested in an encore program, or encore career. They want to use their experience. They still want to engage with society in this kind of, in a work type capacity, but they're encountering ageism with all other employers. So the question is, how long will you stay? And so the question to us is, like, how do we overcome those stigmas? How do we address that question? What are your thoughts here, Mark?
I have so many thoughts, and it's such a brilliant question, and one that's on a lot of people's minds. You know, maybe just going back to the Eli program, when we first gathered at Yale, one of the speakers we invited and who talked to us is Becca Levy, who's a psychologist at Yale and who's the author of the book Breaking the Age Code, which I think is the most important piece of research on ageism. And what Becca Levy has found in her work is that people who have ageist views, who have negative views about later life, live longer, live shorter than people who have positive views. And you know, if we were live, I would ask you, how much shorter do you think? You know, is it 6 months, a year? It's 7.5 years. So the impact of ageism is so pernicious, and it's hard not to have ageist attitudes when we live in a world where that's so widespread. So I really just want to underscore how important that question is, and how important it is for us, even in the face of some of these obstacles, to try to maintain a positive view of the possibilities of this period in life. And I also wanted to address the second question, which I think is always seems to come up, which is that an aspect of that ageism is just assuming that, you know, you're just passing through. It reminds me of the encore career research I talked about earlier, where people basically have an entire body of work, a 10-year body of work, which is not only long enough to learn a new field and to make an important contribution, but it is, you know, outstanding in terms of duration for an employer. And so I think I hope that's a misconception that will be overcome as we come to terms with how much longer people are living. And I think that gets me to a larger point that I wanted to underscore. The biggest issue we have is that we have a whole mindset and culture that's built around people living much shorter than they are now. And so we don't have the imagination for this period of life. And I think that's what the person asking this question is running into with these employers. And in some ways, it's understandable. Before the last century, very few people lived till later life. So we developed a whole understanding of short lives. And, one of my favorite examples of that is Social Security at age 65, which John Chauvin, an economist at Stanford, says, we would never use $1935 in 2025 without adjusting them for inflation. And yet we use this idea of 65 as being old or over the hill as if it was some eternal verity. So all of that's to say that's an incredibly profound question in so many different ways. I don't think I've helped so much on the solutions front. I do think it's a lot like the transformation that happened when millions of women moved into new roles in the workforce in the 70s and 80s. And it's hard to be a pioneer. But I think that's what today's generation of people moving into this new stage are doing. They're forcing attitudinal change by showing up and often fitfully finding new roles that challenge these stereotypes.
Thank you, Mark. I have so many wonderful questions. I am a bit distracted because I want to jump in and answer them myself, but I want to throw this first one to you. How do you see AI impacting the workforce when so many workers are being displaced? In this world, how will seniors find a role with that passion, purpose, and paycheck that you described?
I think some have argued that we're moving into a wisdom economy where the things that are distinctly human will be all the more valued. And that's really when I was talking about the sweet spot that occurs in later life, there's an abundance of research that shows that a whole set of characteristics that are kind of human intelligence really blossom in the later years. One, there's a body of work that shows that older people are particularly adept at relationships. So, we all have an internal clock that we're not even aware of that's telling us that there are fewer years ahead than there are behind. And it keeps adjusting. And when you have that sense of a heightened time frame, you end up prioritizing different things. So if somebody tells you you've got 30 days left to live, you don't think, wow, this would be a fantastic time to take up the oboe, or I always wanted to learn Mandarin. You focus on relationships. And that, in a broader sense, is what happens as we get older. And the skills that grow in later life include emotional regulation, empathy, critical ingredients for forming relationships, and then also a deep appreciation of connecting with younger generations. The Harvard study of adolescent development, which is in its 85th year, I think it's the gold standard of happiness research in later life, finds that connection and relationship far and away is the most important thing. The psychiatrist who led that study, George Valent, said, love matters most, full stop. But second, it's love that runs up and down the generational chain. Older people who connected with younger people were 3 times as likely to be happy as those who failed to do so. So all of that, in response to the question, is I think the things that make human beings distinct and invaluable in the context of AI are the things that blossom in later life, and so I think could contribute to powerful roles for older people.
So true. Thank you, Mark. Another great question. What if you're still young, not 50, but you have the years to retire and you have met the leadership ceiling? What would you advise that person to do in the federal workforce to make more of an impact, make more of a difference? Or would you advise them to move on to a new chapter?
Yes, I mean, I think that that's part of the reconceptualizing that needs to go on. That is that this is a long distance race. We get more than one bite at the apple, and that there the the nature of the work we do as we move into different phases of life should be aligned with where we're at as human beings in human development, in ways that I just talked. So it could be work that's more relationship oriented. As I was just talking about, there's an anthropologist at the University of California, Michael Gervin, who has a new book out called 7 Decades, and he's been doing research in hunter-gatherer cultures all over the world. He's studied 20,000 people, and his conclusion is that even though we see having so many older people oftentimes as a problem in these societies, it's a huge advantage to have a group of people who have discretionary time and have worked and raised kids, know how to do things to become teachers. And he argues that that's the natural role for the older population. In a literal sense, where's the Teach for America for older people? There was a great government program called Troops to Teachers that Senator Danforth pushed for years ago, which was getting retired Army sergeants largely into public school teaching roles, especially men, on the belief that people who'd been on the battlefield with a bunch of unformed 18-year-olds might do okay in a classroom with a bunch of unformed 17-year-olds. So I do think that roles around teaching are whether it's literally teaching or mentoring or other kinds of ways of passing on what we've learned from life are particularly important. But I think the main point would be that there are now opportunities for multiple chapters at work. But the key, I think, is the transition to those chapters. The Stanford Center on Longevity that I mentioned before just put out a report called the New Map of Life. And one of the main takeaways from that report is that transitions are a feature, not a bug, in these longer lives. And so we need to ease up on ourselves if those transitions are bumpy, especially given that there aren't that many pathways to purpose out there. So thanks for another great question.
Yes, this person poses an interesting one that I've heard many participants and prospects describe of, do I do this or do I do this? And ultimately, it's not up to us or the faculty to tell you what to do, but as you've said in a number of different ways, this idea of realigning your experience with your values to inform what comes next. And our society not having that infrastructure to help people at this stage of their life do that. So you describe this time in our life as a DIY process, and that can be a very lonely process. And so, like, part of what I know Yale is trying to do with this program and what others have attempted to do and are trying to do, doing good work doing, is building that community and building that community of support, be it they through peers or through experts in the field, and providing those resources to you those opportunities to experiment, to let you figure out how to perform that realignment.
Yes, really well taken. As more and more studies come out, including a recent batch about super agers, who are the people who live to these ripe old ages with their cognition intact and their physical health, that connection is king. E.M. Forster, the writer, it has a wonderful line, only connect. And I think that's probably true in general, but it's particularly true in this stage of life. And yet it becomes harder to do that, especially as you leave your midlife workplace. I remember we did a series of focus groups a couple decades ago asking recently retired people whether they were happy. And the response we got overwhelmingly at first is, oh, yes, it's great. I love not having to set my alarm clock anymore. There's all of this freedom. And then ultimately you'd ask, so this must be one of the best times in your life. And then the hemming and hawing would start. And it turns out that what people missed most of all was not just relationships. They had relationships with their grandchildren and others. It was what one of them described as productive relationships, the relationships at the intersection of love and work, where you were working together to accomplish something. And that, I saw that among the Yale Eli Fellows, who were all on this journey around figuring out what's next, and having a group of people who are engaged in the same process. That could be your personal board of directors, your soulmates, and just sources of emotional support was absolutely invaluable. I would say one other thing that relates to a few of the questions. Right now, there's a revolution happening in undergraduate education. Northeastern, I think, is the most prominent example of co-op learning, where young people mix internships and academic studies. And I think it's particularly suited for our time and to the future of work. And yet there have been few opportunities for older people to do that. And I talked about those two, going back to school and having a gap year and doing an internship. A lot of people that I've spoken with who've navigated this transition have combined those two things, using a kind of academic experience, going and doing an Eli fellowship to take a step back, to reframe, to figure out what is a priority for them, and then interweaving opportunities to try on this new direction. And I think that's the secret. It's love and work. It's also reflection and experimentation.
We have more questions, but I'm looking at the clock and I recognize that we only have 10 more minutes with you. And you mentioned that you had a second part to what you wanted to talk about. So I want to give you time to share with us that second part while we still have it.
Sure. And and I'll do it very quickly, but I think if the first message that I want to deliver is that, it's not just longer lives, it's a new map of life, and we're seeing this new chapter of life. So qualitatively, there's a very important development happening that's oftentimes less appreciated than the quantitative side of things, but also the primacy of transitions and how we have to move beyond a DIY project. And that can involve some digging because we're not yet as a society prepared for this. But the other message that I wanted to deliver, and very much relates to the first, is that it's not just that we're aging as a society, but to my mind, even more important is that we're becoming a historically age diverse society. If you looked in 1900 at the map from birth to 75 and how many people were alive at each age in between, it's just a downhill slope. And there's hardly anybody alive when you get to 75. If you take that same chart in 2025, it's a flat line. We have the same number of people alive basically at every age, at 52 and 11 and 36 and 41 and 73. And that's never happened before. And this unprecedented age diversity, I think, is an extraordinary opportunity, because I think the needs and the assets of the generations, particularly older and younger people, fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And right now, 25% of the population is under 20 and 25% of the population is over 60. We spend a lot of time talking about midlife, but it's these intergenerational dynamics that I think are most important of all. But the biggest barrier that we face is age segregation. We're aware of ageism, how important it is, but one of the driving forces, to go to the earlier question about ageism, is that people of different age are sent to their own separate spheres. And that's a radical and recent development. At the beginning of the 20th century, we were thoroughly age integrated in society. We had fewer older people, but people in their 50s and 40s and 30s and 60s all lived in multi-generational households. They worked side by side in the fields and an agrarian economy. Even the one-room schoolhouse had 4-year-olds and 40-year-olds learning their ABCs side by side. In 19th century America, people did not know how old they were. Knowing somebody's age would be like knowing their blood type today. You'd never even think to ask. And then one after another in the 20th century, we, for the most uplifting reasons, we had child labor laws and universal schooling. So young people then were congregated with other young people. Even Social Security, to my mind, the greatest triumph in public policy in the history of the country, had an explicit desire to get older people out of the workforce at a time when we had over 20% youth unemployment in the heart of the Depression. Then we invented senior centers, nursing homes, retirement communities, some of these lifelong learning programs, and the generational twains stopped meeting. And we ended up, in the words of Andrew Scott at London Business School, in a state of age apartheid. And so age diversity and age segregation are a terrible mismatch. It's feeding ageism, loneliness, misunderstanding, polarization. And it's also a massive missed opportunity. And I'll just lay out a couple of quick examples. So BMW did a study a few years ago of three assembly lines. Three assembly lines, one just of older workers, one of younger workers, and a mixed age line. The one of older workers, it sounds a little stereotypical, made very few mistakes, but was on the slower side. The line of younger workers was much faster, but error prone. The mixed line was fast and error free. I think of that as a metaphor for the workplace, and what Arthur Brooks at Harvard describes as the mix between fluid intelligence, which is what young people are particularly good at, and crystallized intelligence, pattern recognition, that can only come with experience that older workers excel at. And Brooks argues that there should be no workplace without both of those characteristics. And so I'd like to see us reimagine society, not just work, but housing, higher education, care, in ways that brought the strengths of the generations, particularly older and younger people, together. I think we're going to need to do that as we become a thoroughly multi-generational society. Already we have 5 and 6 generations living side by side. And that's one of the great opportunities of programs like Eli, is the chance to work with young people. So I want to close with that pitch for the power of cross-generational connection and collaboration. And that's the thing of having these different chapters in life. There are ways that they go together. And I think for older people, this idea of generativity, of investing in younger generations as a way to live a legacy. And for younger people, having these connections with older people to get a broader horizon and perspective, and to combine the unique skills of people of different age. So I think in this new chapter in life that's emerging, in this new chapter of working across generational lines can be one of the great assets and great joys.
we have many, if you think about it, there are many young oriented, massive companies here. We have in the tech sector alone, you think of like Amazon and Google. Have you heard of any practices or programs or policies at these youngish oriented companies for older employees or for people of an older demographic? And before you answer, because I want you to answer and give a very thoughtful explanation, I'm going to just to the audience drop my email address in the chat because I realize that we're running low on time and I want you to have a way to connect me immediately, though you will get a follow-up email from me after the webinar. Okay, back to you, Mark. Have you heard of any programs or policies that would engage our older population?
I think the most promising ones are around the idea of with as opposed to for. But most of the efforts I see are, what can older people do for younger workers? What can younger workers do for older workers? Help them navigate technology. I think what we need is not mentoring or reverse mentoring. It's co-mentoring, and the co idea, I think, which is the Latin for together, I think is absolutely essential. And there are too few efforts that really lean into the with. There's a wonderful effort in Chicago that's not a company effort, but comes out of the business school at Northwestern, called Ageless Innovators, which has this co idea front and center. But maybe I'll close with this one piece of heartening research. So, most people think that this is something that older people want to do more than younger people, but we work with the National Opinion Research Center at University of Chicago 2 years ago to poll older and younger people about their interest in the in working together on the big issues of the day. And what we discovered from that research is that the strongest interest in doing that was coming from young people and from young people of color. Actually, young people of color had twice the level of interest as Caucasian baby boomers. And, and they, I think it maps to, we've seen this radical increase in multi-generational housing over the last couple decades, particularly in immigrant communities and communities of color. And so the picture that emerged from this research, well, partly it was, the young people saying to people my age, you can't create all these problems, then pat us on the back and say, go fix them. It's, that's not fair. But even more, no one generation can do that together. And so I see a movement around this cross-generational connection and collaboration actually led by young people. And by young people of color in particular. And I think that's really heartening. So I asked a young person, a friend who's very interested in collaborating with older people, and I said, well, if we older people are modern elders in Chip Conley's sense, what are you young people who want to work across generational lines? And her phrase was old souls. So I think there's a potential movement of modern elders and old souls who want to work with the opposite generation. And I think that's a great hope for our multi-generational future.
I love that. And what a lovely note to end on for this webinar today. Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, and for your willingness to have a conversation with us today. I earnestly say to all of those who are on the webinar, who listen to this recording afterwards, please reach out to us. Ways to stay connected to Mark, to me, to the School of Management will be sent to you in a follow-up email after this webinar ends. And we want you to reach out to us. We'd love to hear your stories, hear about your experiences, and see if the School of Management or Eli can help and be of help in any way. So thank you again, Mark, and thank you everyone for giving us your time. We really appreciated having this chance with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristen.